In this Beginner Basics course, you will learn the basics of the Mini technique. You will create textures, sand them, prime them, apply watercolors to them, and do something we have called a color treatment and then a washout. We will be making 2 pieces during this course. One piece is going to be a practice piece, the other is going to be your art piece. But before we begin, what is the Mini technique really about? The unusual thing about this technique is that we are using watercolors on other surfaces than paper. Watercolors are meant for painting on a special paper. The paper absorbs the color beautifully. Canvases do not absorb paint, so when we put watercolors on a canvas, the paint stays on top, splits up, and become ugly stains. The Mini technique can change that into being beautiful and exciting. This technique has many benefits, but the biggest is that we're able to wash off the paint after it's dry, which means that we can easily correct mistakes or wash out highlights in our paintings even after a paint is dry. And if you change your mind, you can change the color, which also means you can erase the whole painting by washing it all off, and then you can start over. The Mini technique is a non-expensive technique. You can use simple tools from your household and get stunning results. And watercolors might seem expensive, but they're really not, because they are so long-lasting. When you use the paint in the right way, you can get about 70 pieces, like this, out of this little tube. A brush for the priming. Try to get a soft one. If the brush is brand new, wash it and let it dry before use. Brushes for the watercolor paint. These are the most usual ones that we use, and they are made of fiber and they don't have to be expensive. The smallest one is also going to be used for designing. Sponges, the type that you use in the kitchen. This is ordinary paper plates. We will be using a lot of these. They have a layer of plastic on top, which is quite necessary. They don't have to be white, but white is easier. And you can also use plates of plastic. Spray boxes. The spray pump is really important. So get a spray box with a pump that gives a soft spray like a mist. Empty the boxes and clean them in hot water. Pump some hot water through the pump to clean it. As you can see, we are using hairspray boxes, and we always have 5 of these ready at all times. These pieces of fabric are made of cotton. You can make them from an old sheet that has been washed many times or something similar, but cotton is the best fabric to work with. Towels, some old ones, will do the trick. Q-tip, really helpful and cheap stuff. Sandpaper, not too rough. Medium to fine is good. These painting knives are meant for painting in oil and acrylic paint. We are going to use them for something else. You can get them in steel and in plastic. And those in plastic are often very cheap and are actually quite good to work with. Excellent for schools and kindergartens with a tight budget. This is often called tack it. It's meant for putting up posters on walls. We are going to use them for something else. You can get the tack it in office supply stores, bookstores, or hobby and art supply stores. To make things easier, we have put them between two pieces of plastic. Paper towels, the cheapest one for use in the kitchen. It is helpful that we can rip them into square pieces because then they're ready for us at all times. An ordinary comb. Just cut out the piece that you need. We are going to use the smallest one. There are a lot of canvases to choose from, and many of them are not expensive, even though the quality is quite good. There are also a lot of sizes to choose from, which really allows you to play. In this teaching, you do not have to use the exact same size as we do, but we strongly recommend that you use a similar one. Acrylic paint for the priming. You will need ordinary acrylic wall paint for interior to prime the canvas with. Choose a white color and 1 liter will cover several canvases. In hobby and art supply stores, you can get a lot of good stuff to make textures from, but we are going to show you how to use spackle. You can get spackle in stores where they're selling wallpaper, wall paint, and stuff like that. The spackle we're using has acrylic in it and is meant for filling holes and cracks in wood. This spackle is non-expensive and fun to work with, so it's excellent for family projects, schools and kindergartens with a tight budget. You can get spackle in tubes, boxes, and in buckets. It's all depending on how much you will need. Although it's often cheaper to buy big buckets or larger quantities, it might not turn out that way in the end because the spackle might dry out before you get to use it all. That's why we usually buy spackle in tubes which are containing about half a liter of spackle. A half liter of spackle will cover this course and then some. A glass bowl of water. This size works best for us. One in plastic is also fine. You can get watercolors in pan and in tube. We only use tubes because working with tubes is faster and it is easier to get more control over the paint. You will be needing a tube of burnt amber, a tube of ivory black or a similar black color. When you buy watercolors, get them in a good quality. Ask for advice in the store. Make watercolors ready for use like this. Write the name of the color on the plate, put watercolors on and let it dry for a couple of days. When the paint is completely dry, you can pile them up and save a lot of space. But remember, the paint always have to be completely dry before you pile them up. Acrylic paint for designing. In hobby and art supply stores, you can get a lot of different kinds of varnishes ready for use. We use our own mix of varnish. We are going to use a finish meant for hardwood floors. It's waterborne, which also means it is mixable with water. If you prefer to buy a varnish that is ready for use, just ask for advice in the store. Remember that in this technique, you will need a varnish that will stay permanent, and it has to be sprayed on. You may need 1 square meter of plastic to cover your table or floor during the varnishing. Texture is what defines the surface of something. For example, a banana has a really fine surface, a fine texture. An orange has a more rougher surface, therefore a rougher texture. In this technique, we will show you how to make different kinds of textures. And the opportunities are endless. We are going to make 2 pieces. One for the practicing and the other one is going to be your art piece. Use the tack it and lock the canvas to the table. We sometimes spray a mist of water over the spackle so it doesn't dry too fast on the paper plate. So we put water in a spray box and from a distance we spray a mist over it. If the spackle is a little bit too thick, you can do the same thing. Spray water on the spackle and mix it gently. Remember though, not every spackle needs to be thinned out with water, so try it first. Make sure that small children do not eat this stuff and clean your tools with paper before you wash them in water so you don't get all of this stuff in your sink. We are now going to make the texture for the practice piece. Cut a kitchen sponge in half and dip it in water. Grab some spackle and try to cover the canvas evenly. We are going to make a flat and fine texture for this practice piece. Now, use the sponge to even out the surface of the texture. Make your spackle ready. You will need a painting knife, half of a kitchen sponge, and a piece of an ordinary comb. We are first going to make a flat texture using the same technique as the practice piece, and then on top of this flat texture we're going to create a timber-inspired texture using the comb and the painting knife. You know this technique from before, so we are just speeding through it for you. Clean your painting knife because we're now going to scrape off the top of the texture with it. Grab a hold of the comb and twist it. When you can't twist any further, rest it there and change your grip. Roughly clean your comb and make a part of a circle in the bottom corner. The spackle that we are using has a fine texture, also when it's dry, but with different kinds of tools and techniques, we can also make a really rough texture from it. Sometimes textures made from spackle can crack. This may have something to do with the way we mix water into it. The water has to be added little by little. The texture can also crack if the layer of spackle is too thick. So, in other words, there are several reasons that can make the spackle crack. And it also depends on what kind of spackle you're using. Our experience is that for the most part, it all goes well. The cracks can be exciting and add something old and antique to the painting. We really love the cracks if they don't occur in places that we don't want them. If the cracks are not too big or too deep, they can be fixed. We are now going to sand the texture. We sand the texture a little bit to soften down the sharp surfaces and to get rid of loose particles. Use a medium to fine sandpaper. If the sandpaper is too rough, it will leave unwanted lines in the texture. Make sure that you carefully sand the edges. By using your hand, you can feel the difference between a sanded area and an area that has not been sanded yet. Usually, we do the sanding outside or in a room where the dust does not matter much. But as you can see, we have a piece of fabric on the table. This fabric helps us to reduce the dust from spreading in the studio. After the sanding, we take the piece of fabric outside and shake the dust off. Gesso is often used as a priming on canvases, but in this technique we find it not so suitable. This is because watercolors are transparent and has a bright, clear color. Gesso can make watercolors lose its brightness, so instead of gesso, we use ordinary acrylic wall paint for interior. Acrylic wall paint maintains the watercolors' brightness and it is easier to work on. Prime the canvas, let it dry completely, and then you prime it again. How long it takes to dry depends on the temperature of the room. Remember to prime your practice piece. We are now going to apply watercolors on both canvases. We start with the one that is going to be used for the practicing. We are going to use the color Burnt Amber. Use a lot of water, not so much paint. Now it's finished and we leave it to dry. And now the second one, your art piece. We're going to use ivory black on this one. Use a lot of water and not so much paint, because now the color might seem pale, but later, during what we call the color treatment, the color is getting darker. After the color treatment, we're going to perform what we call a washout. so a thick layer of paint is not necessary, and it is a waste of time and money. Work the paint deep into the texture. Let it dry. Both pieces are now dry. Doesn't look very nice, does it? But we are going to change that with the color treatment. The color treatment is what changes ugly spots into beautiful shades. We will show you a technique that will change the color's behavior on the canvas. And this is quite easy once you get the hang of it. This technique is something you have to feel your way into. Practice the color treatment until you get to know the feeling of it. It's the key to your success and opportunities in this technique. Let's start practicing the color treatment, and we will explain on the way. Use the tack it and lock the canvas to the table. This is your tool for the color treatment. You use your hand to kind of give the color a massage. On your hand, there are different areas that you can use. This is the smallest area on your hand that we can use in the color treatment. The biggest area is the palm of your hand. This area right here is what we call the pillow. Wet the sponge in water, and when it starts to drip, it is ready for use. See the difference? As you can see by the color of the hand, this is the area that has been used for the color treatment. The goal is not to make all the stains disappear, but to turn them into beautiful shades. We are now getting a color edge. We have to move the color edge into the wet area in order to even out the color. Don't use too much pressure on the canvas. Just feel your way into it. Let's treat a new area and we will explain what happens. The paint is now getting wet and slippery, and the paint starts to dry under your hand. And then it is getting sticky. When the paint is getting sticky, it evens out. Move your hand in the sticky paint and then move your hand out. Do not let your hand stop on the canvas. It will leave unwanted marks. Repeat the technique area by area. Remember to move the color edge. Tip your fingers up and use the pillow to even out the color. We do this to avoid fingerprints. Don't use too much pressure on the canvas. Just feel your way into it. If your hand is too wet, keep moving your hand in the wet area until the paint is getting sticky. Again, tip your fingers up and use the pillow to even out the color. and to avoid fingerprints. Fingerprints can be difficult to avoid, but they can be fixed. There, you have a fingerprint. Let's fix it. Wet your finger and pick up some paint. Move the paint over to your other hand in order to make it less wet. This is like doing the color treatment to make the paint sticky, but on your hand. And now add some color to the fingerprint. Carefully push and drag. Remember, this is something you have to feel your way into. Let's do it again and take a closer look. Remember, it's now when the paint is getting sticky that the magic happens, and you can change ugly stains into beautiful shades. Our experience from our weekend courses is that people perform the color treatment differently, but they end up with the same good result. It means that your color treatment might be different from what you see on the video, so don't get upset if you see the color treatment in high-speed video in our courses. We will show you how we do it, and then you can find your own way. This technique is something you have to feel your way into. You have to feel when the paint is getting sticky. It's learning by doing. When we squeeze the water out with our hands, we define the pieces of fabric as ordinary wet. So now you know what ordinary wet means. In our other courses, when we use fabrics that are ordinary wet, it will say so on the screen without any further explanation. In the next clip, we are going to show you how to prepare for what we call a slow washout. Take a piece of fabric, dip it in water. Squeeze the water out and roll the fabric in the towel. Squeeze hard for about 10 seconds. Turn the towel around and do it again. The piece of fabric is going to be moist, not wet. If the fabric is too wet during the washout, too much paint will come off. The washout is all about removing paint little by little. The fabric is now moist, not wet, and is now ready for what we call a slow washout. In our other courses, when we use moist fabrics, the words slow washout will appear on the screen without any further explanation. Preparing the Q-tip. Dip them in water, both sides, stamp them on the towel. Now they're ready for use. You might need several pieces of fabric and Q-tips. The pieces of fabrics and Q-tips are ready for use. Get a good grip and stamp the fabric on the table to make it flat. Carefully and little by little do the washout. This technique is all about the unusual use of watercolors and what we can do with it. Normally, textures like this is painted with acrylic paint. With acrylic paint, the washout has to be done before the paint is dry. So in other words, you have to work quite fast. In this technique, you have all the time in the world. You can do the washout anytime you like. You can even change your mind, wash it all off, and start over. Just beware that not all watercolors can be completely washed out. You might find traces of color in the priming, but if you prime it again, you can start over. We just love the washout part. It is so exciting to see the painting come to life. So take your time and have fun with it. Remember, if your fabric is too wet, too much paint will come off. If so, you have to squeeze more water out of the fabric. You can rest your hand on the canvas, but you will need a paper towel to protect the paint, because resting your hand directly on the painting may leave unwanted marks. Don't forget to sign your art piece. Add some water to the acrylic paint to make it thinner. Use a small thin brush and mix the water into the paint. We recommend that you practice the signature until you're satisfied with it. On a smaller art piece, it can often be more suitable with just your initials. To put a clear, protecting layer on a painting is a common thing to do. It seals and protects the painting. This is often called varnish or finish. In our teachings, we are going to use the word varnish. In this technique,
The varnish is totally necessary. If we do not use varnish, the paint will come off. And this is really important. We have to spray the varnish on. In hobby and art supply stores, you can get a lot of different kinds of varnishes ready for use. Some varnishes are removable, others are permanent. We only use the permanent type. We use our own mix of varnish, and we are now going to show you how to mix it and how to use it. We are going to use a finish meant for hardwood floors. It's waterborne, which also means it is mixable with water. That is a good benefit that we are going to show you later. We use this mix of varnish because it's strong, it's not expensive, it dries quickly, and it is almost without any smell. It also has a good resistance against yellowing, and it's permanent. Even though it doesn't smell, we still recommend that you use it in an airy room, so open a window or a door. If you prefer to buy a varnish that is ready for use, just ask for advice in the store. Remember that in this technique, you will need a varnish that will stay permanent, and it has to be sprayed on. Here we have the finish for hardwood floors, and this is a bottle that once contained soap. We just cleaned it and are now going to use it for the mixing. Find a bottle that is suitable for you. Fill it with about 60% varnish and 40% water. We mix the varnish with water just to get it thin enough so we can get it through the spray pump. And even with the mixed water in it, the varnish will still give a strong protection. Mix it gently but thoroughly for about 1 minute. Fill it in the spray box. Remember, it has to be a spray box with a pump that gives a soft spray like a mist. Use plastic to protect your table or your floor. We are going to spray on 3 layers of varnish. First layer. Do a spray test on the plastic and then you start spraying the first layer on your painting. This first layer is really important, so pay attention. Make sure that you spray in a thin layer. This layer doesn't have to cover the painting completely because it is the first out of 3 layers. And after 3 layers, your painting will be completely sealed and protected. If you spray too much varnish on this first layer, it will make the watercolors too wet and they will start floating on the surface. And then your painting might be ruined. At first, the varnish will look like small drops on the surface, but when it's dry, the surface will be nice and even. When you are done with your first layer, let the varnish dry completely. How long depends on the temperature of the room, but usually it takes about 5 hours in a temperature of 20 degrees Celsius or about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. If the first layer is not completely dry, when you put on the second layer, the first layer may crack. Your second and third layer doesn't have to be as thin as your first layer, but remember, every layer has to be completely dry before you put on a new one. If you feel that your painting is not protected enough, feel free to put on more varnish. Put a wet paper towel on the spray pump to keep the pump moist. When you keep it moist, the varnish will not dry and block the pump. The spray pump will now stay moist until you will need it for your next layer of varnish. As long as the paper is wet, the spray pump will stay moist and ready for several hours. A quicker way to do the varnishing is to use an Alkyl-based varnish. Since it's Alkyl-based though, it is not suitable for children. An adult have to do the varnishing for them, and you should do the varnishing outside in a garage or something similar. Spray 1 thin layer on the canvas, let it dry for an hour, then you can spray on the last layer. Our advice during your learning process is that you start on a smaller canvas and then you do the same thing on a bigger one.